Okay, people can hear me. All right, this is good news. People can hear me. Yes, yes. All right. Okay. Let's let's chat. Well, I'm gonna this I'm gonna try and go as long as I can today. And I'm thinking long and hard about what I wanted to talk about. Because look, I mean, I'm not trying to just like I'm not a I think some people think of me as a political pundit. The truth is, I'm quite offended by that characterization. That's like not what I'm trying to do with my work at Notes from the Circus. I'm not trying to be a pundit. Some people might accuse me of being a moralist or a polemicist, and I'm less offended by those labels. Quite honestly, I do polemic, so I am a polemicist. I'm quite proud of it, actually. And I'm happy to talk about that, but I don't consider myself a pundit in any sense of the word. I look down on that characterization. So like what I try to do is right. I'm trying to since I have a worldview. I don't hide it. One of the things I've tried to do in my practice as whatever it is I'm doing, writing at Notes from the Circus is try to be completely transparent about like what my worldview is, what I actually think. I talk about my metaphysics, even in terms of like my views on spirituality and sort of like the nature and foundations of love. I wrote an essay on what I think love is, a treatise of love in my grand praxis here. So I try to be like I'm like out there. You can if anyone's interested about like what I think about the nature of the universe and like political philosophy and morality, I've written it all down. It's there. You can look at my philosophical statement. So I try to. I'm biased. I'm biased. I'm a very biased person, and my bias is very carefully documented for everyone to see, and they can evaluate that. And if they think my biases are wrong, I'm always happy to have people challenge me. I'm open to being debated. I'm not afraid of being challenged in my views. So I just want to be very clear up front that like what I'm doing at Notes from the Circus is I'm speaking my worldview out into the world. And my worldview, I hope, people receive it that way, is a pluralistic one, like at its core. Like I call myself a liberal. I think I am a liberal, and um, and part of that liberalism is accepting that there are many valid perspectives on the world, right? There are many different ways of living a life um, that is good and pursues what philosophers call the good life, and in pursuit of eudaimonia, right? From Greek word, right? Of high the flourishing, like our higher good towards sort of a common human good flourishing blob of happiness into the future that we're all trying to pursue. The pursuit of happiness is what that is the same object that our founders were pointing at when they wrote our founding documents. And I accept that there are many different kinds of ways to live life that get you there. And so I am not the kind of person who tends to be judgmental about the way people live their lives. I don't tend to be judgmental of people's spirituality, as long as it's humane. Obviously, if you tell me that your God demands that you eat babies, I'm going to have a problem with your religious belief if that's the case. I'm sorry. I mean, my liberalism has its limits. So I mean, but like but within that container, like I think of myself as um uh a pretty liberal person when it comes to that sense. Although I also am not a libertine. I believe in virtue, as many, and I know that I have a lot of. What's interesting is I know I have a lot of religious readers, and I know even that, and I've said repeatedly that I'm not a Christian, although I know that, I've seen that there's been some Christian blogs that have like referenced me and have appreciated some of my work. So And I'm honestly honored that some Christian theologians would think to say nice things about my philosophy. So, we can talk about that, and I'm certainly not offended by that. I'm not arguing with those things. I'm simply trying to demonstrate that I think that there are transcendent truths that we can talk about through different traditions, including Christianity and other religions and Eastern traditions. That and I talk about some of this, like, right. I've written about, like, mythology, for example, right, like, and I have, like, and what's interesting is, like, even though I don't really identify as a Christian, I have deep respect, right, for, like, J.R.R. Tolkien and what he did with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, as a sort of a mythologist, sort of like teaching Christian virtue through a constructed mythological world. I mean, people study this, and have been sort of like fascinated by that kind of thing. You know, before he went completely insane, Jordan Peterson was talking about some of these things too, before he turned into like a right-wing fascist lunatic. And so, and I think those are interesting topics of discussion. So I'm trying to paint a picture for you that, like, I have a very, like, open worldview, not open worldview, but an open sort of sense or open heart to, like, many different ways of approaching the same truth. So not only am I a sort of a pluralist, I'm also a meaning pluralist, which is kind of a radical idea of saying that there are, like, multiple ways of knowing the same thing, and that they're equally valid, and that one should not judge one way of knowing over the other. That is, one of my, that's like one of my beliefs. Now, that's not the same thing as moral relativism, because my liberal ethics are not morally relativistic in that way. They still demand, like, the unabridgeable principles of human dignity, right? That we talk about. So there is a container. I'm not a moral relativist who says that, like, because you have a certain religious belief that says that, like, these people over here shouldn't have rights, or women shouldn't have rights, or gay people or trans people shouldn't have rights. Like, I don't recognize your right to impose your metaphysical tyranny on me, as a liberal, just to be clear. So I'm not a relativist in that sense. So, but when I say there are multiple ways of, like, knowing, of arriving at the same truth, I think there's, like, different ways of looking at things. One of the things that I, you know, have written about several times in some poetry and some essays, as well as in the aforementioned essay that I wrote in the Grand Praxis series, A Treatise on Love, was about the story of Adam and Eve and the nature of the serpent and the apple. And thinking about, the relationships of these, these entities in the story, and, like, what they might tell us about universal truths, like stripping away the sort of the baggage of literalism, and just trying to understand, like, what is the moral story being told here. Like I said, I've written about this. And, and to a certain extent, right? I mean, it's been written about many times. Like, I think the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, which I mentioned before, in Tolkien's, J.R.R. Tolkien's world, was much doing the same thing that I'm now doing with you now, which is seeing that, like, in this story, you can find these things that are, like, fundamentally true about the universe, even if you don't literally believe the story of the Garden of Eden, and that you don't literally believe that there was an actual Adam and Eve, and that there wasn't an actual serpent, and that there wasn't an actual bite out of the apple of the tree of knowledge. Like, these things are narrative details, but underneath there is a structure of, you can simplify them into a way of thinking about, um, you know you might call them like normative rule sets, I guess. I mean, I'm trying to come up with a way of thinking about this, and you can tell different stories in that same using those same rules. We've seen this happen a lot, right? The people, people who study literature and the study of stories will know that, that a lot of stories sort of like mirror the Jesus story, right? Like famously, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, George Lucas's films, right? We have these echoes, these retellings of these journeys, right? And so like this isn't radical. I'm not saying something that like hasn't been known. But what I am saying is that like there are some interesting things to look at here that might, in some ways, believe it or not, even have implications on things like physics and certainly metaphysics. So that's a long way of saying that there's, as I said, many ways of understanding the same truths through different lenses. And I'm a strong believer in the necessity of storytelling and narrative and using fiction. Like for another example that people like to talk about is the series Andor, right? And I'm a huge fan of it, as well, for all the same reasons that people talk about, how it's sort of a it's a masterpiece, right? Like Tony Gilroy's Andor, spanning 2 seasons, is a marvelous, uh, um, you know, political moral storytelling, right? About like sort of the rise of fascism, right? And the rise of resistance against it. And I think things like that are not just like fun things. I think they're like critically important teaching tools in society, right? This is why, I mean, we teach kids morality through fairy tales. Like this is intuitive to us. We've always used storytelling as a way to communicate like moral teaching. And this is clearly what religious scripture does. It serves that role. And both religious and secular storytelling like plays that role. And we teach moral lessons through stories, some real, some fictional. And we should talk about the fictional aspect of storytelling, because the fictional aspect of storytelling is the product of imagination and creativity, which I think we should like pause on this for a moment, because I think, if you ask me, this is my opinion, this is my metaphysics, this is like my way of thinking about philosophy, that creativity is like the height of human agency, of consciousness. Like to imagine something, to have moral imagination, to think of a world that could be more just than the way that we are in now. To me, right? And like that is like, in some sense, you can even extract that, and I will, right? Like I said, I wrote this treatise on love in the Grand Praxis series. Like I think you can find love there. I think you can find love almost as like a law of nature, tied up in this idea of creation, of meaning, of thinking about like a better world and then figuring out how to build that better world so that it can be shared with others, right? In the pursuit of a more perfect union, right? Coming back to the idea behind the founding of this American Republic. See how all these things like thread together? There's connections. There's connections through our language and our stories and history, and you can see them There are those are those universal truths, right, that are floating there in front of us. I'm trying to draw your attention to them by I'm moving from topic to topic, but I'm doing this deliberately to show you that these separate topics are not really separate topics. They're just labels for like for patterns in connections in this like great tapestry that I have decided to be so bold as to call meaning. And we live inside it. And inside it, we build it together. And that togetherness, I think, it turns out, is inseparable from like there's no way to think about, like, we can, like, there's a philosophy like Wittgenstein talked about like the impossibility of private language, right? This like the paradox. And the idea that like you could imagine a world in which like you're the only person in the universe and you've never met anyone else, that you could develop your own language. Like, what would that even mean? Like, why would you have words? Words are to communicate to others, not to yourself. So like there's when you start thinking about these things like really deeply and you sort of find these paradoxes in language, and these aren't, like I said, these aren't new insights. This insight's over 100 years old. And those who are philosophically trained will know exactly what I'm talking about. Like that points towards an irreducibility of even the idea of a morality, of a sort of a notion that there is something right in the world, that like if you can't reduce there, then you must at least accept the idea that like any morality that one might arrive at as a basic consequence of this observation, of this sort of impossibility result in thinking about defining language itself, necessitates a social reality. And you've heard this, we are social beings, but like we're not social beings because like we hang out in like villages together and have dinner together, like that. We socialize, and I think that that's sort of intuitively what people think about when we say that we're social beings. But no, it's more profound than that, right? Like you are speaking a language that you did not invent. You're using technology that you did not build. I mean, Steve Jobs made this observation in an email that he wrote to himself. It's published, on his, I think on a memorial site, that makes this observation. I think it was a beautiful thing he wrote. And you have to understand that like you're here, like I'm in a house right now. The house I'm in actually is like, I think it's like over 100 years old. I didn't build it. There's like a history here, right? Like the decisions of like where the windows are placed and where like everything is was made by people who came before me. And therefore my movement through this house is constrained by the choices that were made before me. That's what we call contingencies in philosophy and in mathematics, physics. And so, like, when you talk about this sort of like interconnectedness that we all share with each other, I think a lot of people think that that's very woo-woo and supernatural, but it's like not. It's literally true. Like even if you are an atheist and completely secular, and you look at the math and the science, right? Like these contingencies, you see like, that like even in the most secular of terms, you cannot escape the reality that everything is connected to everything else. Like, this is just true. It must be true. I mean, if it wasn't true, our physics wouldn't make any sense. So, like, putting aside, all of the debates about, uh, an omnipotent God, or a sort of a Spinozan God, or multiple gods, or no gods, or whatever, like we can actually like see through some of the haze of that, of all these discussions, and see that there is a universal truth, and that is that everything is certainly connected. That's shouldn't be controversial. Like, I mean, what would it even mean to live in a universe where everything isn't connected to everything else? What would that even mean? It's incoherent. You can't even get everything off the ground. I mean, I'm here because I'm connected to all the things that happen before me, right? Cause and effect is literally the chain of everything being connected to everything else. There's no escaping this general pattern. So I think that like it doesn't matter what religious or spiritual tradition or metaphysical tradition you show up from, everything is connected to everything else. And that seems to be true whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu or an atheist. It doesn't matter, really. Everything is connected to everything else. And I think that is a profound point. And I think like, everyone of all the philosophical traditions should not be able, I'm willing to hear a counter argument to that, because I'm approaching this as scientifically and neutrally as I can, and demonstrating to you that this principle holds. I don't think it's controversial. Like, I think if any physicist sits down and thinks about it, it's not a controversial point, right? Certainly, I think we need like special, the Eastern traditions like Taoism, are generally going to be very appreciative of my framing here, right? Like, this sounds a lot like the Great Tao. But I also think that like you can find these sorts of things in Western traditions too, if you look for them. It's just like a matter of like how you adjust the categories. So, um, there's an example of what appears like we were able to sort of like steer our ship through, you know, history and stories and ideas, and look, we found a universal truth, and it's kind of a beautiful universal truth because it it sort of reminds us, right, that that there is this connection. There's this connection to history. Like, our ancestors mattered. It mattered that your parents met and fell in love and made you. If that didn't happen, you wouldn't exist. I mean, that's just true. It's a contingency. History is a contingency. So we're here in this country. We have a republic that we're trying to keep or remember, and I'll talk about that distinction in a moment. Because like certain people in the past made sacrifices, we remember them for this, right? The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Second World War. And we benefit from those sacrifices today, from those contingencies. Like, so this then, I think, brings rise to the question of, like, what is our moral obligation? Like, what is the normative implication of that connection? Well, I mean, I think it's quite obvious that, like, if one is to situate themselves in that reality, inside that universal truth, like it seems to me that like one should be appreciative of any sacrifice that came before you, um, and that you should understand and see that there were people in the past. You can call them like suckers, like Donald Trump does to dead soldiers, or hopeless romantics, or you can try to minimize their sacrifices. But the point that you should probably sit with, and I certainly do, is that those people wanted to believe that their sacrifices meant something, that there would be people in the future that would be living in peace, and that they imagined that future and they gave their life for that future. And you sit in that future and then say, "Well, I don't really care, that I didn't have anything to do with that." And I mean, there's that. I mean, I know that's like a very sort of like popular way of thinking about it on both the left and the right, quite frankly. And it's a view that has always upset me. It's always upset me because, um, you know, the idea that a human would give the full measure of their devotion, the ultimate sacrifice for their community or their loved ones, and we would turn around and say, well, that was a different time. Like, there was just stupid people making war. Like, fuck them. Like, I mean, I don't care. I don't like history. Like, I mean, I'm gonna be honest. Like, that view offends me. It's always offended me. It's always kind of felt like there's these people who lived and were loved, and they don't exist anymore. They gave up. They gave up their life. So you could live in a more just world. And you're like, well, I mean, they were dealing with a mess that I had nothing to do with, and that somehow allows you to sit here and sort of judge them and being like, well, I mean, and you hear this all the time, and I'm going to be quite harsh on the political left now, and I know most of my listeners are on the political left because I think leftists make this error. And they make it a lot, right? Like, first of all, I want to say that I am a feminist, but I'm going to criticize feminists a little bit, and I know it's dangerous territory, because I've had this conversation with some feminists in my life, including some academic feminists, and I sometimes hear the notion that, like, those sacrifices and stuff were only necessary because of like patriarchy, and if like women had been afforded their rights earlier on, none of that would have happened. Like, fuck men and their war. Like, this sort of kind of very. I mean, I get it. Like, I get why they're saying it, and I'm like, and like, of course, like it's a moral tragedy that like women have not been afforded their equal standing. And like I said, I consider myself a feminist, but I mean, like, one of the reasons why women now have this equal standing in society is because a lot of people sacrificed for the liberalism that allowed for it. And if we are simply to say, well, I don't give a fuck because it was like those like, I mean, there were men that at the time that thought that women should have more rights. They may have not been in the majority, they may have been the minority, but there were men that marched with the suffragettes so the women would get the vote. There were male allies throughout history for women's rights. I'm not saying that they were in the majority, but they were there. And like, the truth is a lot of those men who stood up for women's rights themselves found themselves on the wrong side of history. Like, so I'm just trying to say that, like, people take a lot for granted, and it upsets me. It really does. It upsets me. Um, because, like, the full measure of those sacrifices, that one can sit here on their moral high horse in this year and say, well, you know, X or Y person from history, you know, was didn't like believe in gay marriage. I mean, like, I get it. Like, I mean, like, I believe in gay marriage. I was an advocate for same-sex marriage in my early 20s, like when a lot of my friends were not. And like I stood like I but like at the same time, right? Like I can recognize that if like 200 years ago, right, people who grew up in a society, right, that was less tolerant and less liberal, and there was more like people were products of what they were taught, and they were afraid of punishment and social ostracization, and a lot of people had to keep their liberal views private because it would get them killed. And like a lot of and like so the way in which the way in which leftists in particular replay history in their minds and just see nothing but a bunch of like fucking like evil old men like making fucking bad decisions about the world. Like, I mean, really, I think seriously, like, well, first of all, it doesn't give a lot of women credit throughout history too for like helping a lot of these things along, right? Like there, I mean, we know a lot of like men throughout history were like, especially even intellectuals in some ways, were in were their wives sometimes were actually powerful intellectual interlocutors, like we, that that we now, now know give a lot more sort of credit to their sort of contributions to history. So I just find this this failure to recognize that there's a lot of people throughout history who genuinely wanted the future to be better than the past and gave up their lives so it would be. And the modern left has been quite dismissive of this. And it's always been something that I'm very uncomfortable with. I mean, uh, the people who, I mean, I know that there was a draft in World War II, but there was also millions of volunteers. And like, had they not fought, it's possible that Adolf Hitler and uh, the Mussolini and the Japanese Empire of Emperor Hirohito would have done quite a bit more damage to the human project. So I mean, I just find this dismissiveness on this point of sacrifice to be something that I just like I struggle with, right? Like we're here, like I mean, the republic exists because like another example of it, of course, is the sort of the dismissal of the sort of the founding moment as a bunch of like slave owning old men, right? Like, I'm a scholar of Thomas Jefferson, and I am not unaware of the fact that his family estate continued to own slaves. But like, one should also not be unaware of the fact that Jefferson struggled with this internally. He kind of knew he was a hypocrite, right? Um, and whether you want to tend to that or not, you have to accept that that's moral growth. The man was uncomfortable with slavery, even if he never quite like, it's even if he never quite like was able to sort of like put himself out there. I mean, like like you can see if you look, you can see signs of moral growth in people, of people starting to realize that like maybe what I'm doing is evil. And Jefferson certainly showed signs of that. He was trying to rationalize things to himself, like that, like maybe like, you know, African Americans were like lesser beings and stuff, and that's all disgusting, of course, like by today's standards. But you could kind of see the man was like kind of torturing his soul over the question. And it's like, would you rather have him? Would you rather not have had that bridge of where you have someone like that who's morally questioning themselves and writes down transcendental truths about, you know, fundamental justice into our Declaration of Independence, and then contributes to the birth of the idea of a self-governing nation, the republic, that, you know, ultimately abolishes slavery, ultimately reconciles its contradictions. Women are made equal citizens. I mean, like we like this is like the republic has progressed towards a more perfect union under the transcendental trajectory of people who put themselves out there, you know, on the wavefront of moral imagination. And the absolute refusal by like aspects of modern left to sort of view history that way, to me, seems like absolutely frustrating. And it's frustrating because it robs us from the idea that like moral progress itself is possible even now, that people can change, that a Trump voter can, that someone who's MAGA can renounce their views and realize the error of their ways, that there's a path of redemption, that people don't have to feel like they're going to be outcasts for the rest of their lives. I mean, psychologists call this a permission structure, right? That like, if you're going to tell somebody that like the consequence of the choice they made is that they'll no longer get to participate in the game of life anymore, the game of civilization anymore, then like you're not really making them a very compelling offer for them to change their mind. You're basically saying, change your mind and accept exile. And that's why I don't like cancel culture. Not because I don't hate racism, I do. Not because I don't hate sexism, I do. Not because I don't hate homophobia, I do. Not because I don't hate transphobia, I do. But because I have always thought that the purpose of what we're doing here is the pursuit of a more perfect union towards greater truths, towards greater justice, and that means changing minds. Because like this idea that like we're going to do a purity test and say like, well, we're the only people who count are the people who agreed with us already. The only people, the only people who can come to our, who can come to our party are the people who were never bigots to begin with. Like I just don't understand this tendency in the modern left. I'm sorry. Like, I'm not like, look, I'm not like trying to be fucking Barry Weiss here. You guys, if you've read my shit, you know how much irritated. I think she's a fucking fascist apologist. I'm not saying that. This is not like an anti-woke tirade. I'm trying to like actually like advance some basic principles for thinking about like how to actually build a better world. Because like, I want to live in a better world, because right now this world is in great danger of going to some very dangerous places. Now, I think a revolution is afoot. I think this is the greatest revolution in human history that we're about to see all throughout the world as a result of this technological revolution, AI, robotization, um, and I also think just a massive upheaval. I think we're about to see the global established order collapse under its own contradictions. And I mean, there's reason for great hope in that picture. But hope must be sustained, I think, you know, by a commitment to sustaining that moral imagination and that faith that people can change. I think they can. That's what I think. And you know how I know? Because they have before. We've seen it. I know plenty of people who used to be against gay marriage and are now embarrassed that they were ever against it. That's a beautiful thing for someone to realize that, like, they were wrong to want to exclude people and now realize that they never should have thought that way. Why would we be like that? Why would we be like, but you never should have been homophobic to begin with? It's like I mean, I just don't understand the point of thinking about things that way. Surely what matters is not what was, but what is and what can be. What is obviously the most important thing. It is the place where we live, and what can be is the site of our imagination and our creativity, our agency, our free will. Like the essence of what makes us. And so I suggest that if we are to make a clean world with our hands that we have, that we must be prepared to extend them to those who were once our enemies if they offer their hand to us. That doesn't mean that that does not mean that we do not pursue justice for those who have committed crimes. It does not mean that, like, examples must not be made for the purposes of history and memory. I'm not saying that. I think there are a lot of people who need to go to jail. And I'll talk more about that in future videos and essays. But if we truly want to live in a world that does not descend into some apocalyptic end, and that's on the table. We have a bunch of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, AI. We have a lot of ways to wipe humanity out on this planet. So my plea is that people think about the sacrifices that came before them, that they recognize the reality of where they are and how things are, not how they want them to be, but also recognize that through patience and gentle, sustained attention and a commitment to work together towards a better world, that we provide the space for moral imagination and a brighter future to emerge. This to me, I think, is I mean, an obvious truth when you think about it. And I know that it's a bit off the to the side. I didn't really talk about Epstein or anything today, but I started Notes from the Circus to talk about philosophy, and so I thought I would talk about some philosophy today and how I think about the world that I inhabit. And I've shared that with you tonight. Um, and take what you will from it. You don't have to agree with me, but that's how I see things. So thank you, everybody, for joining me tonight. And I'll be back and see you soon. And if you don't subscribe to Notes from the Circus, please do. You can find it wherever fine Substacks are sold. Thank you, everybody.